Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar, Adopting Salesforce DX. Thank you so much for joining. We're really excited to share this information with you today. Chris couldn't make it, so I will be your host, so just a small change to the lineup you see here. I'm Danielle Fox, and I'm on the Platform Product Marketing team here at Salesforce. Today, we're joined by Jim Wunderlich, Principal Architect, and Mike Miller, Architect. They'll be speaking about the benefits of bringing Salesforce DX into your organization and give you an insider's view into how you can streamline your development lifecycle by adopting Salesforce DX. So just a quick note before we begin, we like to bring up the forward-looking statement. This is to let you know that when considering future developments, whether by us or with any other solution providers, always base your purchasing decisions on products and features that are currently available. So just a key takeaway, we're a publicly traded company. Just make those decisions that are commercially available currently. And please keep the conversation going on social media. As you can see, we're well represented. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. You'll actually see this webinar posted on our Salesforce developer channel on YouTube after it's completed. And please remember to use the hashtag SalesforceDX in your posts. And with that, we're ready to get started with today's session, Adopting Salesforce DX. So go ahead and take it away, Jim and Mike.
Hi there, I'm Mike Miller, and I'm excited to join you on this path to adopting Salesforce DX today. Let's quickly go over what we're going to be discussing. We'll start off by talking about the principles of modern software delivery and how Salesforce DX helps support you in adopting those in your organization. Different ways that you can adopt Salesforce DX. We will go through a demo of an example migration of into a Salesforce DX workspace, and then we will also touch on some challenges in migration and help you with some tips on how to more effectively make the migration into Salesforce DX. So again, the principles of modern software delivery, you may have seen this slide again in other sessions, but we want to highlight a few things here. The key points of modern software delivery here are that what you're doing is project-based modular development. You have your teams which are collaborating on source, which is stored in a version control system, and the team is using environments which are easily created and destroyed. You've got continuous integration and delivery systems, which are ensuring a high quality product is always ready for release to production. And all of the systems that you're using are built around open standards so that they can easily be integrated into your preferred workflows and tools. So Salesforce DX supports these key principles. With Salesforce DX, the source of truth has moved out of the org and into your version control system. And all of the rest of the processes drive from that source. The CLI is a building block that can be integrated to support the entire application lifecycle. Developers are using Scratch orgs and the CLI with their preferred development tools and IDEs to collaborate on projects. And that same CLI can be integrated into various continuous integration, continuous delivery systems of your choice to create Scratch orgs which match the shape of your subscriber orgs so that you can test your source code is ready for production in any number of different target environments at any given time. So what does it mean to adopt Salesforce DX? It's not just an all or nothing proposition here. We've been working hard on this. Hopefully you like it, and we would love it if you adopted the whole enchilada. If you took everything from source-driven development and Scratch orgs and integrated it in your continuous integration delivery, but you don't have to adopt the entire thing to get started. You can dip your toes in the water by starting with just the CLI. Install the CLI and use it for some of your common development tasks, authenticating into different environments, doing things like SOQL queries or creating data in orgs, things like that. You can also integrate it, the CLI into your continuous integration and delivery and use scratch orgs. Build scratch orgs with different shapes to better test your code, again, for that readiness for production. Your developers can adopt the source-driven development piece of it, where you're using VCS as your source of truth, using scratch orgs and the change tracking capabilities to be able to better synchronize and have a continuous development experience between what's in org and what's in your local developer workspace. So what we've talked about so far is really the mechanical part of adopting Salesforce DX, using the tools that to support your development process. For many of you, the challenging part is going to be organizing the code you have into what we call projects. We fictionally call the metadata in your org, the collection of all that metadata, the happy soup, right? And so you need to be able to break that happy soup up into projects. And what does that mean? What is a project? A project is really a group of related code and customizations that can be tested and released independently. These projects, the source components can live in only one project at a time, but you can have dependencies from one project to another. So breaking it up, modularizing your source into a more manageable piece that will give your developers a better developer experience. So with that, I would like to walk through an example of a migration with you. In preparation, I've installed the Salesforce DX CLI. I have that on my local computer here. And then I've also got a couple of my orgs set up that I'm going to be using for my development process. One of my orgs is something new that we've introduced, the Dev Hub. And the Dev Hub is the central place where you can manage the access to Salesforce DX. You can see what scratch orgs have been created, manage those scratch orgs, all of that. So here you can see that I've got my org that has been enabled as a Dev Hub. I also have an org where I've got my existing project that I want to migrate into Salesforce DX. In this case, it's the Dream House app that you may have seen in various other webinars and demos. And to begin this migration, one of the most straightforward ways is to create an unmanaged package that contains the components that I know I want to extract into my Salesforce DX workspace. So I'm going to start here. This is my production org that has my application in it. I'm going to create a new unmanaged package here. And I'm going to add a few things to that package. I know that the key component that I want added is this Property Explorer app. And by adding that to the package, a lot of the dependencies will automatically be spidered into my package and added and ready to be brought down into my workspace. I do know that the spider didn't pick up a few things that I do want it to bring over with me. One of those being the tests that I've written. As a good developer, I've developed these tests ready to ensure that my code is always ready for production. So I'm going to add those tests. I also know that this application isn't available to everybody in my org by default. And so I've got a permission set that I want to include. And lastly, I know that there's a relationship to another standard object, a custom field for my application that I need to add in to my package. So now we've gone through and added all of these components into this unmanaged package. So let's go back to the CLI. And here, I'm just in an empty directory on my local file system. And the first thing I want to do is scaffold a new project. I want to create a project structure on my workspace that is compatible with Salesforce DX. So let's go ahead and build that. And we can see that it's laid in a default directory structure and some default configuration files. The next thing I need to do is attach those orgs we were just looking at to my local workspace. And I'm going to authenticate into those orgs to do that. So let's start out by authenticating into my Dev Hub and make that my default. Oh, and that went to the wrong place. Excuse me a minute. Oh, right. So the problem was that I did not change into the new workspace that I just scaffolded there. And in this case, I've got a special server that I'm hitting for this demo. So let's try that again. Let's authenticate and attach my Dev Hub. And then secondly, I need to attach my production org so that I can extract that metadata into my workspace here. Same thing, now with my production org. So we now have a workspace created. I have both of those organizations attached to it, and we're ready to pull down the contents of that unmanaged package that I made. And so we're going to do a metadata API retrieve of that package, and I'm going to store it in a temporary directory in my workspace. All right, so we have that. We now have a zip of our unmanaged package. Let's go ahead and unzip that. And then we need to convert that source from the existing metadata API directory structure into our Salesforce DX project. So now if we take a look, we can see that we have our original unmanaged package, and then we also have now our Salesforce DX source form. And you can see that there are some new capabilities within the Salesforce DX source form. Things like custom objects have been decomposed. So rather than having one gigantic file with everything in it, each field for the custom object is in its own metadata file. Each list view is in its own metadata file. You're also able to take these files and move them around freely on the file system to structure the source in whatever structure makes sense for your particular development experience. I also know that in my org, I've got some sample data that I created that I want to include in my repository. I want to extract that data, I've got a query here that goes out and will pull that data into a set of files that I can use for integration testing, for unit testing, things like that. Okay, so now at this point, I've got all of my original metadata and data converted into my Salesforce DX workspace, project workspace. And so I want to test that now. And the way to test that is to use a scratch org. So the scratch org is that it's an ephemeral org that you can use for declarative development tasks and also for testing the changes you make in your workspace. So let's go ahead and create a scratch org. And scratch orgs come up predominantly empty. There's no metadata in them other than default stuff that's included in the particular edition. They can be different shapes. You can have different features enabled within them. You can have different preferences. In our case, we've got a fairly bare bones scratch def that's created by default. So I'm getting a developer edition org that has the Lightning desktop enabled. So now we can see we've got our scratch org, our two hub orgs attached to the workspace. And let me open that scratch org a second and we'll come back. The next thing I need to do is I need to take that source that I've converted and push it into my scratch org. So let's go ahead and kick that off. While that's happening, we can take a look. So here's our scratch org. We can see that it just has the default settings within it. We don't have any of our metadata. We don't have any of our data. So what we're doing right now is we're taking and pushing our source metadata into the org, our source into the org, and then we'll go through and set up the rest of the org for our use here. And so again, just to review, scratch org's empty. We've pulled our source down from the original org, converted it, and now we're pushing that into the scratch org. So we now have our metadata there. But as I mentioned, the app that we're working on is not available to all users. So I need to assign that permission set to my developer user here. So we have a CLI command that allows you to do that. And if we go back over here now, look at the app launcher again, we'll see that we now have our Dreamhouse app in this scratch org. But it's in there without any data. So let's go ahead and we can run an import command that takes that data that we exported from the production org, and the import will now load that into our scratch org. And now here we are ready to go. We've got our app fully running within our scratch org in just a matter of minutes. Now, we've gone through the process of converting it and deploying it to a scratch org, but those tests that I have, I want to run those to make sure that this migration, this adoption was successful. So let's start out by running our Apex tests and having it output a human readable format. So as a human, I want to see the results of the test and something that's easy for me to quickly hone in on. And we'll see if we, hopefully we'll get those magic pass outcomes here. So here we can see the tests have run and passed. Now, as we said, the CLI is also open and ready to be integrated into other systems. So let's take a look here. Let's do the same test run, but this time let's output those results in a JUnit format. So here you can see that the same test run happened, but the outputs are now ready to be integrated into any variety of tools that can process that JUnit format output. All right, so we've got the source converted, we've put in a scratch org, tested it. The last thing we want to do is we want to clean up after ourselves. Again, scratch orgs are designed to be transient. They're not intended to be long-lived, so I want to go ahead and delete my scratch org, clean up after myself. And just like that, our scratch org is gone. We now have a project workspace that's ready to be committed to whatever version control system you prefer, and future scratch orgs can be created, integrated. This source can now be integrated into your continuous integration, continuous delivery runs, and the entire application lifecycle. So let's just touch on review what we just did here, the recipe for migration. We installed the CLI, we enabled DevHub in our production or business org. There is a free trial available. We'll touch on that a little bit later. We scaffolded a project workspace ready to be added to VCS. We could modify the scratch org configuration for desired shape if the default shape wasn't sufficient for your particular application. You may need to add some what we call features or permissions to that. Preferences to that. We retrieve and or convert the source from your existing VCS, your existing org or VCS repo. Some of you may already be doing source-driven development, and so you wouldn't need to do that unmanaged package piece. You could actually just start at the convert step and convert your existing source into the Salesforce DX project workspace. You would commit the workspace to your VCS. Your developers would start using source-driven development using the CLI, and then you would integrate into your continuous integration and delivery systems driven from that source that you've now migrated. And so now I'd like to hand this off to Jim, who will talk about some of the challenges in the migration and ways you can approach that.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for that demo. That was great. But as you might have noticed, that demo was awfully dense. So I want to go over some of the highlights of what's important when you embark upon your DX journey here. For those folks that are already organized, have already organized their development into more project-like things. This includes things like ISVs that are pretty much forced to create things into projects because they're going to release them to other people. But even larger organizations can organize their development into projects. For instance, like if you have you're a customer, you might have a package that does accounts payable and accounts receivable that you're working on, or a group of extensions for a particular package. Some of you might have already organized your stuff in projects, and some of you might have already externalized using the metadata API, what you could loosely call source, and are driving your development using that change tracking. You might have used AMP tools and everything else. For those groups, this is a bit like, I'm going to be a bit like a Santa Claus here. I've got a lot of goodies for you from SFDX. And I just wanted to go over those a little bit. If you're already doing CI, you can easily switch over to using scratch orgs, which will let your CI perform a lot better and not leave a lot of remnants around as you run your CI. Commonly, what's done now is people are using DE orgs or other orgs that have been configured. And the problem we're trying to solve with scratch orgs is that you don't have to uninstall things anymore. It's Salesforce. It's very difficult to reliably uninstall things. So it's hard to always have the org be exactly a copy of what you're trying to develop. That's what the primary use case for scratch orgs are. So for those people that are already doing this kind of work, then let's switch to scratch orgs. what you get out of SFDX is a better change tracking experience. Right now, if you're driving your projects from metadata API that is checked into a VCS, it's hard to track the changes that you might have done in one of the orgs. You tend to write them down and create your own package.xmls. I want you to start using the CLI instead of ANT tools and other forms, that since you can now trigger Apex and even Lightning tests directly from the CLI. So changing your scripts that are in your CLI. And one of the nicest things you get out of this is after you've switched over your source form from metadata API to what we call source form, you can organize your directories and your files any way you want to. So no longer are it's a rigid along the lines of metadata API directories. So you get this benefit right off the bat. So you have the easy path. Unfortunately, I have to be a bit of a bad cop for those people that haven't organized their stuff in projects, and that's what Mike was demonstrating. This is, you're going to have a longer path to taking full advantage of SFDX. If you aren't familiar with VCS or even SFDX, which is hopefully most people on this call, that's why we're just rolling it out now, I encourage you to go over to the Trailhead modules. There's now 4 badges. A really good one talks a lot about Git and GitHub basics, which is a good VCS to try to understand if you don't already have a lot of experience with VCSs. VCS, by the way, is a version control system. I think it already says that on the slide. But this is the central organizing place to resolve conflicts, to track changes, to drive your development. So a really good background on VCS is one of the first things you need to do. Then you want to take what Mike was demonstrating, the bulk of that was about taking your large org, and it can be when we say large org, it doesn't mean a whole lot of rows, but a lot of customizations. I mean, you could be just a one-person shop and have a whole lot of different types of development going on inside of an org. And what Mike was demonstrating was that you want to be able to start pulling these things out into projects that can be, in essence, tested and released independently. So things that are naturally go together that you can develop against alone, and even if it has some dependencies, and we'll talk about dependencies in a second, that you can efficiently develop and release. And don't get confused with the word release with what we call managed packages right now. There are multiple ways to do the release. What's key here is to be able to have smaller projects that you can do development on quickly and then roll them up into the bigger orgs. It's very difficult when you have to, like many of you might be familiar if you do use managed packages, that every time you upload a new package, you have to run every test that's ever been written. It's hard to do efficient development when you're working on everything all at one time. It's really easy when you're doing it declaratively in the org. That's one of the things that Salesforce brings forth, is that, look, you can do development across everything in an org, but it's not very efficient when you're using these modern development techniques of isolation and project-based development. So this is the hard part. This is the thing that you need to give some thought to, that we can't automate for you. And that is that you need to organize this in your projects. Mike demonstrated when you do, it's easy to organize yourself into an unmanaged package and extract that source or that via the metadata API, that you can prime the pump for SFDX type development. So what would be a kind of a project? Well, everything that would be like Lightning components and objects and workflows, everything, layouts that support a particular application. I mentioned like accounts payable. Maybe it's a seminar registration app that you built. Modern development is all about, often called apps. You might have heard that all over the place. It's a bit of a loaded word, what that means exactly. But you can kind of see if I have a page and a custom object and some reports and some triggers, workflow rules, some process builder, you can see they all go together. And they run somewhat independently of all the other things. And so that makes a really nice project. That's what most projects get aligned on. But because Salesforce is so customizable, you might think of it also as the customizations that you've done for a particular team. Like the CRM cloud, the sales team in the CRM cloud. You might keep your CRM customizations separate from your Service Cloud customizations. And so that would be a logical separation of projects. This is all types of development. This is one of the things that it's not always just coding. A lot of development is just customizations, like creating a set of reports for Service Cloud versus creating a set of reports for Sales Cloud. Those would make a good separation between two different projects. Extensions related to a package installer. For a lot of people, when you install an App Exchange package, there's a lot of customizations that go along it. There might be some layout changes. There might be some new reports. And every time you install that App Exchange package, you want to make sure you install those extensions at the same point. This makes a great project because now you don't have to push your entire org every time. You can, every time you install a new version of this App Exchange, you can redeploy your extensions. They go hand in hand. That's what we mentioned about the dependencies. That also makes a good kind of project. While those extensions may not have anything to do with your accounts receivable system that's in one of the earlier projects you pulled out. There's one tricky thing though, and we're going to answer the question in the Q&A because a lot of people are asking a very similar question. What do you do with shared business logic and schema? Schema refers to all the custom objects and custom fields, and possibly workflow triggers. The business logic is, the workflow triggers, the process builders, the things that drive process from inputs to outputs, right? I'm going to take those two things separately. For business logic, for things like goes into Apex, it lends itself very nicely to a shared package or shared project. I'm sorry, at this point we're talking about packages because projects, we're not so much talking about packages because for a lot of people that means managed packages. That having a library, common library project that everyone can depend upon means that when they start up their Scratch org, they put that common project in and then their project goes in. So that is a great solution for things like Apex. Schema is a lot more difficult. In theory, different parts of the schema, if you look at there could be two different packages that add two different fields to account. Neither one of those may not need each other, so they could go into separate packages. In reality, if you have an existing org, though, it is very difficult to pull those parts apart from each other. And so what the common practice tends to be is to put your schema into a common project, because it's a standalone thing, and then only separate those things as you move forward that are truly separate, like a workflow rule. Like let's say you have a workflow rule that sends an email only for an AR product. Well, that kind of lends itself to go into the project for accounts receivable. But in reality, most of your stuff will start in common schema and then move out as you further refine your projects. It's a common question. My gut feel is that schema isn't going to end up primarily, a lot of it's going to end up in a common package project if you already have a lot of existing stuff. Business logic will hopefully move toward common packages like an Apex library, that kind of thing. So I want to finish up by talking about some anti-patterns. So an anti-patterns, if you're not familiar with them, is things you shouldn't do or is highly discouraged not to do. That tends to not end well. But part of anti-patterns is also to tell you what you could do instead. Like it's not really an anti-pattern unless someone has a way out of it. And so this is the top ones that we've already come across. The first and foremost one is not just, if you have a large org, don't just pick it up and try to put it into SFDX. It won't perform well, and you'll be curious, like, what is this doing for me? If you want to pick up your whole org, you can kind of stick it in metadata API, like many of you are doing it right now. It doesn't gain a lot until you start doing this project-based development. So think about this thing about trying to pull pieces out of the org rather than picking up the whole org. Be careful with schema. I already mentioned that. For many of you, you'll end up putting your schema in its own project that everyone will depend on. Watch for shared objects. This is another thing I was mentioning about, like Apex. If there's more than one use of an Apex class, utility classes, those kind of things, then it's logical to put them into a common project that everyone depends on. The whole point about dependent projects is one project can say, I need that other project installed. There's various amounts of automation currently available, and we are continually building more automation so that we can automate that process for you. Running without CI. If CI stands for continuous integration, although Mike's demo didn't show any CI, there is some CI behind it that was reacting to his changes. The CI is the biggest benefit to making this transition and building a CI test system so that every time you commit a change to a VCS, you run some tests. And what that does is it gives quick feedback to the programmer if they're not going to the developer, if they are going off the reservation. The point of CI is to catch errors early. Make sure that things don't stay around long during the development cycle that will cause problems later on. So setting up a CI run is a very important thing at a minimum on what we call every commit. Don't export live data from production orgs. So one of the common, probably most people on this call are very used to sandbox-based development. That is a very valid method of doing development here. We encourage people to do it, but it's different than SFDX development. Those two stories we're working on integrating those two stories. But one of the things that are good practice in doing modern development is not to test with live data. There's two problems with live data. One problem is it's not consistent. What you don't want is your testing framework to change every time a temporary change to live data happens. That makes it really hard to keep up, because then you're chasing like, well, there's this piece of data that may or may not even be valid, but it's breaking your tests. You want to test that at the last possible moment. If you're reacting to those at every commit, you'll be doing a lot of extra work. The other problem is security. For most large organizations, or any organization that has some kind of a government policy around development, the use of live data that could potentially be have personal PII, but most data has some sensitive restrictions around it. When you have a governance and having test data set up addresses that. And so we no longer have to, during the development cycle, expose live data. No integration testing. That was what I was mentioning, was before you install this code into production, you want to make sure you bring up, for instance, a sandbox and that's been refreshed, and you put your code in there first. That's that last bit of testing to make sure you're not going to break production at the last moment. Developers want to rapidly develop features. That's what this commit, CI, constant change tracking is doing. But the release process is all about locking it down, stabilizing it, and getting it into production. So don't forget your integration testing. It's often sometimes called user acceptance testing also, but it's the idea that at that point you're working with live data. Reliance on profiles. One of the important things as we move forward in SFDX development is to remove as much as you can from profiles. I know it's very, very difficult, but we're adding more and more features in perm sets so that you can start moving your access controls out of profiles. Some things like layout mapping has to stay in profiles. But we're trying to reduce how much work you have to do in profiles during development as we support more and more permission sets. Profiles will never go away completely, but we want people to start trying to move, as they move this project work through, to start building perm sets that reflect what's in those projects and stop relying on the gigantic profile that we have now. So those are some of the anti-patterns we've already found. How do you get going? You can either enable a dev hub in a production or business org for those people that have paid accounts. And there is in setup, and there's a dev hub tab that you could enable it. It has to work in Lightning. That portion of it only works in Lightning. I think a lot of people are asking us. So the actual dev hub portion, not what you do development every day, is only supported in Lightning. Or you can get a trial org with DevHub enabled. It's a 30-day free trial, and you can go to that URL there and sign up for a free DevHub. DevHub is central. I think Mike showed a little bit of it, is where you organize your Scratch orgs and your development activities. The actual development activities are going on in Scratch orgs and in your local laptop or server. Make Trailhead your next step. For anyone who's just starting off, make sure you go through these 4 badges. They're all very valuable. If you don't really feel comfortable in VCSs, the Git and GitHub Basics is a great badge. Great introduction to VCS, especially along these lines that we're talking about here. Git and GitHub is the current favored VCS for most people. It's a great place if you don't already have one. And a lot of other organizations use other VCSs, and of course you'll want to use those.
So now, as promised, onto our Q&A section of the webinar. I'll jump right in. We've been getting lots of great questions. So first off for you guys, what is the best process to convert and deploy the changes from a DE org to a DX org? And what are the considerations if we have things like translation and multi-currency in the initial DE org?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I touched on it briefly that with Scratch orgs you can set features. So in that Scratch org definition file, you can go in and you can specify things like multi-currency or translations, I believe was the other one in this example. So, the extraction and conversion is exactly the same. You attach to your DE org, pull that source out using metadata API. If you've already got that source out of your DE org in a metadata API zip, you can just start with that zip and do the conversion steps from there. And then, like I said, once you have that Scratch org definition with those features enabled, every time you spin up a Scratch org, it will have that ready to go. And so when you load your source into it and your data into it, all of those capabilities will be in there. The documentation has a full list of features that we're currently supporting, and we're working hard to add a lot of other features that you guys are asking for.
Okay, great, thanks. Next question. What should be the approach if we want to deploy the DX org metadata to another DX org by using Git repository?
I can take that one.
You're going to take that one, Jim?
Yeah. So so one I wanted to mention a little forward thinking hearing statement, which is if you haven't found out about our package 2 work, that is the next wave of SFDX that's going to be rolling out, which gives you a lot of choices about how you can move metadata between orgs. So what we know of unmanaged packages, the ant deploy tools, the change sets of today are being rebuilt to be a consistent model that you'll be able to do all your distribution with. Though that is now just coming out, it's going to take another half a year to get them worked out. So what's available today? The CLI should be able to replace what we lovingly known as the ant migration tools. A lot of people use ant migration tools to do this kind of deployment from a DX org metadata, from metadata API into other orgs. That's available to you, but what we want you to do instead is use the CLI. What we call source form can be immediately reconverted into a metadata API package that then we have commands in the CLI to do that deployment. So you can script all that using the CLI today. Soon, if you stay on top of the package 2 developer, the pilot, I believe, going soon, and beta by Dreamforce, you'll see what's known as developer control packages that bring some order to that and some tracking to it. So you'll see a lot of exciting things, but if you want to do it right now, script using the CLI, using the metadata deploy. That process is pretty straightforward, actually, and just a couple of commands.
Okay, great, thanks. So I think this follows nicely this next question. So previously we've been used to creating packages from sandbox to production with only the delta of what was new, so things like change sets and ant. So in SFDX, the best practice is to modularize. So what about deployment? Should we deploy everything or just the delta?
You should deploy everything at this point. When package 2 comes along, because you want to try to follow what we're doing in package 2, when the developer control packages come along, we'll optimize that for you. Right now, it's a little bit, yeah, you have to deploy it all, but we will be optimizing that, like I said, going forward.
Thanks, Jim. Next question. Will everything be available as metadata, or are there some configuration tasks that still need to be tracked and moved manually to the Scratch orgs?
The initial release of Salesforce DX is targeting, it'll support all packageable metadata. And so anything that you can put in a managed or unmanaged package today is supported through the entire Salesforce DX process. As Jim said, you can use the metadata API, deploy and retrieve, to pick up some of those other pieces that may not be supported today. The goal is to have Salesforce DX support all publicly available metadata types, and then we're also working to identify some of those key other components that are not even available in metadata API today, and making sure that Salesforce DX supports those in the future.
Yeah, I'd just add one thing, and to reiterate what Mike was saying, that we have an active project. We're actively investing in finally plugging those missing gaps in metadata for some of that manual tracking.
Okay, awesome. Next question here. How do you recommend handling metadata that's shared across different applications? I've heard using a common application or package is a good practice, but how is that package set up across other apps or packages? Is the entire code included, or is there a better way to handle dependency management?
I can jump in that one, Mike.
Okay.
I think I kind of touched on that a little bit, and I saw that asked several times, so I asked Danielle to ask it again. What we want people to stop doing, although someone asked this more refined question, is copying the same code into every package with maybe a different prefix or something. We want people to use standard shared libraries. That library, or this project, right, often called a library, would have those common elements in it. It's pretty straightforward if you think about Apex being a shared library, because it's just a bunch of code. When you talk about common schema, as I touched on, you wanted to put that in a package. It would obviously not. You don't want to copy that into every other package. You want to make it dependent, which dependency means that you're going to have that one installed first before you install the new package. That's what, in simplistic terms, that's what dependency means. Right now, you have to script that yourself using the CLI. But we are, when package 2 starts running, that's the other part of package 2, is you'll be able to define those declaratively, and we will implement those for you. We will optimize for it, and we will make sure those dependencies are installed correctly. Someone asked the question, a related question, which is what happens when they vary. We are still working out that story. We are, and sometimes that can get tricky. But that's what nice having about the CI system fully running there. Those will be identified quickly and help you resolve those conflicts.
Great. Thanks, Jim. We've been getting a lot of questions around Classic versus Lightning and how Salesforce DX fits in there.
Yeah, so as I think Jim touched on this earlier, that the Dev Hub capability to enable that is only available in Lightning. However, once you have your Dev Hub enabled, when you create your Scratch orgs, the Scratch orgs can be used for either Classic or Lightning development. All existing development modes are supported through through the Scratch org. So your developer flow, your CI test runs, all of that can include, you know, either or both of those.
Okay, great. Another question around Scratch orgs. Can developers using DX and consultants work together in Scratch orgs? So let's say there's a consultant that doesn't use DX at all. Can they still log into the Scratch org and do things like make configuration changes that developers can then pull into the DX project?
We have a CLI command that allows you to either add a password to the Scratch org, or you can create users within those Scratch orgs. So, you know, you could imagine that you would go into your Scratch org, add a user login for your consultant to work with you, give them that login, and have them do their modifications. Those modifications through, if they're doing them through the setup tree, you know, those will be tracked, and you'll be able to pull those down into your local repository. You know, sharing Scratch orgs is not really the model. Like ideally, we want a Scratch org to be specific to a developer, but we understand that there are some cases where it might make sense to have some collaboration in the Scratch org.
Great, and that actually answered another question we had around if 2 or more developers can work in the same Scratch org.
Yeah, the idea with Scratch orgs is that they're so easy to create, that they're so quick to create, and because they're driven from your source repository, each of your developers can get the exact same environment out of that and have that consistent development experience without you know, stepping on each other or worrying about those conflicts at the org level, right? You can resolve those conflicts then within your version control system, which is better suited to handle that team collaborative environment.
Okay, great. Another question here. Are there plans to allow us to do force source pull from a sandbox?
Yes, but it won't be organized quite like that. We are building, we're extending what we call change tracking, which you're seeing in push and pull, to work in sandboxes also. So exciting stuff coming. I'm hoping that maybe if you come to Dreamforce, you might even see some of it. So we are extending our change tracking up to sandboxes. It's just not available yet.
Thanks for that. Another question, will Scratch orgs be able to pull in configurations or records based off of production, or is that process manual?
That process is manual. You would have to identify those configurations and retrieve them using the metadata API commands in the CLI or the data commands. Like Jim was touching on also, like you want to be careful in particular about data, right? And make sure that you're not pulling any sensitive data that everybody should not have access to. So, you know, it is a manual process at this point.
Well, yeah, I think, but it's manual, but scriptable.
Correct. Yeah.
I want to just clarify that a little bit, because Mike's saying makes it sound like it's really hard. It actually isn't that hard. What's hard is that, like Mike was mentioning, like you want to be smart about it. And so we have in the CLI now is the ability to extract some rows, store them in your source, because remember everything's going to be in source form into your VCS, and load that as part of your Scratch org creation. So that's how typically you would move that configuration data from production to sandbox, to Scratch orgs. And like I said, with the caveat, please be careful with that. Exporting production data can be risky.
Okay, we have about 2 more minutes here. I'm going to ask a final question. So do you pull down all source from a brand new org to put into the master branch and then build from there? Or is the point to create a bunch of new projects as you need to customize the org?
Yeah, well, I'll mention, so I mentioned it in the anti-pattern. Don't export your whole org. try to use the unmanaged package without making, actually building an unmanaged package. We have this way for you to organize your stuff into a list and your components and being able to pull that out. That's our recommended approach. You can flip it into a big master branch and try to do it that way. But I think if you've been doing this for a while, that might be an awful lot of components. It might make it much more difficult, and you lose the declarative ability to do that.
To expand on that a little bit, one of the patterns that we've seen be successful also is if you have new development projects starting up that are independent, that do fit those criteria we were talking about, the project criteria that is independently testable and releasable, that's an easy way to get started into Salesforce DX, is to run those projects using Salesforce DX, and then over time start to break down your existing applications and to modularize those to fit that same model.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much. I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar today. That concludes the presentation. If we did not get to your specific question, you can reach out through that developer forum and using our social media page with hashtag SalesforceDX. Thanks again for your time, guys, and everyone on the presentation, and enjoy your day.
Thanks, everybody.